Go ahead and get started today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Dear colleagues, I want to welcome you to today's interactive discussion and organized by the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and UN Women. This session is part of our joint collaboration to share and discuss the principles explored in the Gender and Security Toolkit, which you can find online on UN Women's website and DCAF's website. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants, as well as hosted on DCAF's YouTube channel. Before we start, I want to go over a few housekeeping issues. Interpretation is being provided today for English, French, Spanish, and Russian. I take this up as well as international sign language. I take this opportunity to remind all panelists to speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can work effectively. During this webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode with microphones muted. After our first 4 expert presenters, we will open to Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please ask it using the chat feature. You can do this at any point while the presenters are speaking. You don't need to wait until the end. We will read as many questions as possible and allow the panelists to respond. You can ask questions in the chat in French, Spanish, Russian, or English. If you are interested in the response by a particular panelist, please indicate who you're directing your question to. At the end of today's webinar, we will share a link to a brief evaluation survey. We encourage all participants to provide your honest feedback on today's session. Your feedback is valuable and helps us choose the topics and refine the format for the following webinars in this series. I want to quickly share a 10-second poll that I'm going to ask my colleague Vic to share, asking all of you to respond with which language you are accessing this webinar in. Please take a moment to respond to the poll we've just shared. I would now like to hand the floor over to Christina Finch, Head of Gender and Security Division at DCAF, to introduce the webinar. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Dear colleagues, on behalf of our event co-hosts, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone who has joined us today for this conversation with a panel of experts on military spending and women, peace, and security activism. As Natasha mentioned, this webinar is one of a series grounded in the Gender and Security Toolkit, a set of resources jointly published by UN Women, OSCE ODIHR, and DCAF last year. The full toolkit is now available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, plus parts in 9 other languages. The Gender and Security Toolkit offers guidance on how to promote gender equality within the security and justice sector, and how the security and justice sector can better contribute to gender equality in broader society. It's critical that armed forces and other defense institutions are accountable to the communities they serve. To that end, the Gender and Defense tool, one of the tools of the toolkit, can help governments better understand the need for gender integration and how to take concrete steps to create more gender equal institutions. Good security sector governance means providing security for all equally, and integrating a gender perspective is necessary to ensure that all aspects of an institution, from budgeting to legal and policy frameworks, support security provision that actively promotes gender equality. When we look at the issue of military spending, we see that it is intimately linked with security sector governance. Research shows that the relationship between military spending and gender inequality is stronger in countries with lower levels of democracy. Poor security sector governance, including limited transparency in military expenditures and weak civilian oversight, plays a critical role in excessive military spending. To help explore these connections and discuss how to engage on this issue, it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists and 2 commentators. First, the Honorable Dr. Hedy Fry. Dr. Fry has been a member of Canada's Parliament since 1993. She's the longest serving female member of Parliament in Canadian history. As a parliamentarian who has served on committees dealing with national security and foreign affairs, she is well placed to share insights into oversight of military spending. And Dr. Fry is also the special representative on gender issues of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly since 2010, and so brings an extensive multilateral experience to this question as well. Our second panelist is Ms. Estefania Vela Barba, the Executive Director of the NGO Intersecta, a feminist organization fighting discrimination in Mexico. Intersecta has been researching and advocating on the intersects between militarization and violence. Ms. Vela Barba is herself a lawyer who has taught and published extensively on public policies for equality. Next, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Abigail Ruane, who many of you will know as the former director of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's Women, Peace and Security Program, and who spearheaded the Move the Money campaign on military spending and women, peace and security financing. Our final panelist is Dr. Ruth Carlitz, Assistant Professor of International Development at Tulane University. Dr. Carlitz's research looks at government responsiveness to citizens' needs, and she has research to share with us on military and human security spending. A warm welcome to all of our distinguished panelists. And then, after the panel and question and answer session, we'll invite reflections from 2 UN experts. First, Nora Allgaier from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. Ms. Allgaier has been working in disarmament for nearly a decade, bringing experience from Geneva to New York, as well as from Thailand and India. And Dr. Pablo Castillo-Diaz, Policy Specialist on Peace and Security. Dr. Castillo-Diaz has worked with UN Women for nearly 13 years and recently led a process to develop evidence-based analysis of military expenditures, policy recommendations, and advocacy that links savings in military spending to investments in economic and social development. A warm welcome to our 2 UN experts to provide reflections and to everyone here today. It's my pleasure to now pass the floor to my colleague, DCAF's Gender and Security Fellow, Dr. Megan Bastick, who will facilitate today's certain to be fascinating discussions. Megan, the floor is yours.
Christina, thanks so much for the introduction. So last year, on the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1325, the UN Secretary General outlined 5 forward-looking goals for the decade. And one of these goals was reversing the upward trajectory of global military spending, with a view to encouraging greater investment in social infrastructure and services that buttress human security. Military spending was, of course, again, a prominent focus in the Secretary General's recent annual report on women, peace and security. But also last year, despite the pandemic and a shrinking global economy, global military spending continued to climb, reaching nearly $2 million million US dollars. So military spending outpaced spending on the COVID pandemic throughout the world, and in particular in fragile and conflict-affected countries. The lost opportunities to redress poverty and hunger, inequality and disease are really very hard to fathom. Additionally, militaries, we know, are massive contributors to greenhouse gases, so to our climate crisis. Curbing military spending has been a central objective of the women's movement for peace for more than a century. But still the links with disarmament and military spending are quite weakly made in WPS policy. For example, only 4 of the UN Security Council resolutions on WPS address weapons, and only 39% of national action plans even mention weapons-related issues. I think for many of us who work on WPS and on gender and security, it's really hard to know how to engage on military spending. So our governments don't welcome comments on it when they consult on the National Action Plan. Ministries of Defence might welcome support on gender policy, gender training, but they don't want to talk to us about their budget. So this webinar aims to give us all some fresh ideas to help take us beyond just identifying military spending as a big problem to strategic activism. So what we're looking for is, I would suggest, examples of success at national levels in reducing or constraining military spending, and to think about the roles that women have played in this and women's activism. We're interested in learning how parliaments play a role in reducing military spending and how women's voices and gender perspectives may have been integrated. And we're interested in thinking about how we can strategically use women's presence to transform militarism and the global arms industry. So as has been said, we have 6 expert contributors. We're going to first hear from the 4 panelists and then break for a sort of Q&A before coming back to our UN experts. As Natasha said, don't wait to send your questions in. You can put them in the chat at any time. Thank you. So Ruth, first I'm going to call on you, please. Could you tell us a little bit about what research tells us about the relationships between gender equality and gender inequality and military spending, and what difference women's participation can make? Thanks, Ruth.
Sure, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today and learn from you all today. So I'm going to focus my remarks on 2 questions. First, what does academic research tell us about the relationships between gender inequality, women's participation, and military spending? And second, what does research tell us about the role of parliaments, and in particular, the role of female representation in parliament in reducing military spending? And I'll conclude by highlighting gaps in our knowledge, which also point to potential strategies for activists interested in reducing military spending. So on the first question, my research has primarily focused on the trade-offs within countries between military spending on the one hand and spending on human security, including policies that disproportionately benefit women and girls. Now, these trade-offs are most pronounced in conflict-affected countries, where military spending is typically more than twice the proportion spent on health. My research has also shown that military spending has crowded out policy measures aimed at addressing the economic and social toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. In much of the world, military spending has dwarfed pandemic-related fiscal measures, particularly those related to population health. And we see this even in countries that are not classified as fragile or conflict affected. My research also finds that military spending crowds out policy measures designed to target women and girls' particular needs during the pandemic. So using new data compiled by UN Women and UNDP, I found that measures targeting violence against women or addressing unpaid care, these types of policies were less likely to be enacted in conflict-affected countries, and were also less likely to be enacted in countries that spend relatively more on their militaries. Now, importantly, this disproportionate military spending has in turn been shown to entrench gender inequalities in society. This was brought up in the opening remarks. And this happens both directly by limiting expenditures on social services, but also indirectly by limiting women's labor force participation, which in turn sustains gender norms that reinforce women's subordinate status. Now, on a more hopeful note, a growing body of academic research points to women's representation in parliaments as an important lever for change. Now, recent decades have seen dramatic increases in women occupying positions of political power. However, female representation, this isn't a magic bullet for achieving better outcomes for women. So in a recent study I published with Valeria Mechkova, and I'll share a link in the chat after my remarks, we argue that female representation is more likely to lead to outcomes that benefit women when female citizens are more actively engaged in politics and society. Our analysis focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, which is home to the largest recent expansion in women's political representation. And we find that increased female representation in parliaments is robustly associated with reduced infant and child mortality, as well as greater spending on health. And these effects are magnified when women in these countries are more active in civil society. And they also appear primarily in countries that have gender quotas and proportional electoral systems. In a related global study from 2018, and I'll also share this in the chat, Amanda Clayton and Par Zetterberg find that legislative gender quotas led not only to a substantial increase in the number of women in parliament, but also a shift in government priorities, increasing health budgets at the expense of military spending. And I'm currently working on a follow-up study with the co-author I mentioned, Valeria Mechkova, where we're looking at whether and how female representation, both in parliaments, but also in other key government agencies like health ministries, relates to the implementation of gender-sensitive policies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We still have a lot to learn about the processes through which military spending can be reduced, as well as who the key actors are. And one big challenge for research on this topic is a general lack of transparency around what even constitutes military spending in the first place. So in my research, I, like most scholars in this field, have relied on aggregate yearly figures produced by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. And these figures are based on open sources, which is basically whatever governments decide to define and make available under the heading of military spending. But there's a lack of uniformity in these definitions of military spending. And furthermore, the details of military spending are often kept secret for security purposes. And of course, this may be merited in some cases, but the public surely has a right to know a lot more about how their tax dollars, or whatever currency you're thinking in, are being used in this sector. And the lack of transparency in military spending, this makes it hard for researchers to precisely estimate trade-offs, and thus to pinpoint which aspects of military spending can realistically be reduced and shifted elsewhere. And furthermore, relying on aggregates for military spending, this can have perverse consequences. Studies have shown that when foreign aid donors made lower military expenditure a condition for giving aid, this provided a direct incentive for aid recipient countries to underestimate their military expenditure to meet those targets and receive that aid. So I think one fruitful avenue for activists, and this is also something that would benefit researchers who are interested in policy change, would be to demand greater scrutiny of military budgets and greater justification for expenditures that are kept off budget and out of the public eye. Line item data can give both researchers and activists a better sense of priorities within this sector and help to separate worthy priorities for national security from those with more questionable benefits. And so I'm excited to hear more from Dr. Fry and others on this panel about the feasibility of these types of strategies, and really just to learn more about how academic research can further the goals of activists in this space. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm going to share a bunch of links in the chat now and look forward to listening to the other panelists.
Ruth, thank you so much. That was such a good start, because you're demonstrating that research does really confirm what I think feminists have long said, that military spending and gender inequality is this vicious cycle, and that we need to address them hand in hand in some ways, and that there is some hope that women in parliament and more inclusive parliaments can be part of that difference. With that, turning to you, Dr. Fry, please tell us how parliaments in your experience have played a role in reducing military spending.
Well, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the objective. The Secretary General of the United Nations, even in the pandemic, noted that more money was spent on military spending during the pandemic than on health resources and healthcare dealt with the pandemic. And I think that's something that is quite disconcerting. I didn't realize that until I read that information. And I think that what we need to talk about when we talk about security, everyone says that military spending, arms control, etc., are all part of security, that the countries need to feel secure and keep their people secure, their population secure. But actually, we're finding that that's a very narrow definition of security. That security needs to be broadened. And I want to just quickly talk about the OSCE. Look at OSCE. With all of the refugees coming into OSCE, many of them are blocked at borders of European nations that can help them. And in fact, they're being used as pawns. What happens when you have hundreds of thousands of people in a region like the OSCE region with actually no home, no place to stay, fearful for themselves and the generation of lost children who cannot get schooling and healthcare, et cetera, is that after a while, people will rise up. There is a security one needs to think about when we look at how we deal with issues of human rights and of compassion and of dealing with social problems that we need to face. People who are poor, who are always left out, will rise up eventually. History tells us that. So broadening the definition of security means we must bring in issues of human rights. And we also must recognize that where more money is spent on defense and on military spending, that actually in these countries that are spending that money tend to have lower economic growth. They tend to not have good social programs, et cetera, so that their own people are left behind in this struggle. I think the Women's League for Peace and Freedom, Alternatives to Militarization, says that there are some important things we need to think about when we want to talk about looking at military spending. That we need to actually focus on issues of alternatives such as disarmament, demilitarization, and investment in social and economic development in the countries in which there is this high spending. In Canada, actually, we are not doing that well. We increased between 2020 and 2011 our military spending by about 26%. And we're committed to increasing, in 2017, we're committed to increasing that spending from 18.9 billion to 32.7 billion so that we can be strong, secure, and engaged. And we now know that none of those words apply to good security, really. So we know that in 1325 was adopted by the UN in 2000, and that in fact, there is a disproportional impact of conflict on women and girls and on economic renewal and rebuilding after conflict. And that alone is something that we need to think about in terms of looking at human security. When women have been engaged, in fact, in 1325 in peace and security, and we found that in fact, that when there is a peace agreement, that in fact it's 35% more likely to succeed for 15 years when women have developed those agreements. Now, the United Nations Secretary General has asked for the development, in 2004, the development of national action plans for women in peace and security. And to September 2021, we note that 51% of United Nations countries had national action plans. That was 60% of states. but 35% of them alone had funding. In fact, 80% of them with national action plans had not put any money into funding their national action plans. Now, unlike NATO, speaking about the OSCE has no regional action plan, but they launched a Women, Peace and Security toolkit in 2019. And that toolkit gives us some definition of what nation states need to know and to do when they're looking at this particular issue. Now, Canada has a national action plan, because I wanted to wear all my hats here. I'm sorry if I'm jumping from Canada to OSCE. But the National Action Plan in Canada is its second national action plan. We created one, and the National Action Plan must be reported to Parliament each year. Now we're moving on a third action plan, because our second action plan went from 2017 to 2022. Now, the OSCE Gender and Security Toolkit is very clear. It says the defense institutions will not be successful unless it involves civilian oversight, parliamentary oversight, and media oversight. And I think media oversight is one that's really important. The media don't seem to pay a heck of a lot of attention to any of this. Now, what is the role of parliamentarians? And now getting to what you really want me to talk about here. The role of parliamentarians should be to scrutinize and approve defense budgets. They also have a role in which they can legislate certain changes in finance acts and in other legislation. And they need to continue to monitor and investigate and report on, not just somebody, I think Dr. Carlitz was telling us that very few people agree on what we mean by military spending. Well, in this case, I think in Canada, we're talking about procurement, financing of military and defense agreements, personnel, and looking at operations, and to mandate an independent oversight, like an ombudsman or a civilian person that will be able to also look at it, not just parliaments. And I think so. That's the first thing. The most important thing, though, is that we need to look at our budgets entirely. If we're going to look at women, peace, and security, we need to look at gender-based budgets. We need to look at gender-based analysis, in fact, on everything we do. And when I was Minister for Status of Women in Canada back in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had introduced gender-based analysis to the budgets, and we were trying to get all departments to do so. Of course, all departments did not buy, and they didn't understand what they had to do with gender-based analysis. This was all about women, wasn't it, and about girls, and it had nothing to do with anything. But we did adopt and brought in very clearly and legislatively in 2017 the fact that all of our budgets must have gender-based analysis, and I think that's very important. Now, Canada, as you know, is a parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster model. And so I just wanted to say that many other nation states based on that model have similar ways of looking at this. The first way that one can look at oversight by parliamentarians, of course, are standing committees. And we have standing committees in Canada. The United Kingdom has standing committee. And we've seen that they have brought in their standing committees to do this kind of oversight. For instance, in Canada, for instance, in October 2016, there was a report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs that looked at an opportunity for global leadership, Canada, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And it looked at the Women, Peace and Security agenda and Canada's role and felt that the government of Canada should make WPS a priority of its foreign policy agenda. And in October 2020, the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense invited Canada's very first ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Jacqueline O'Neill, to speak on and answer parliamentarians' questions about Canada's contributions to the WPS agenda. In May 2019, the Senate Standing Committee on National Security was looking at violence within the armed forces and sexual violence within the armed forces. And also in June, the House of Commons Committee on National Defense looked at the way to improve diversity and inclusion in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so amongst all of these reports, the general consensus was the use of gender-based analysis to incorporate gender perspectives into armed forces operations policies and programs was essential. That the representation and retention of women in the armed forces was very significant and important. That oversight and accountability of the armed forces operations and activities must happen, and the training and education on gender equality and gender-based violence and diversity must be a part of any military ops. In the United Kingdom, for example, their parliamentary committees have recently studied questions regarding women in the military. For example, in 2021, the United Kingdom House of Commons Defence Committee published a report entitled "Protecting Those Who Protect Us: Women in the Armed Forces from Recruitment to Civilian Life." Now, while studying the question of women in the military, the committee heard from witnesses, including government officials, members of the military, and civil society. And again, parliamentary oversight and parliamentary looking at this issue must include civil society organizations. Now, other initiatives in the United Kingdom include an all-party group of women, peace and security that they established in 2006. I think that's a really important initiative where women across party lines can come together and talk about this issue. And the work focuses on the United Kingdom's implementation, again, of WPS commitments. And each year the group scrutinizes the government's report on its National Action Plan implementation, amongst other activities. Now, DCAF, UN, and ODIHR call for integrating gender budgets in defense budgets. And I think, as I said before, the Canada Gender Budgeting Act, which began in 2018, actually include gender-based budgeting in looking at military and in every departmental expenditure. Now, for the first time, we are hearing from the Minister of Finance to these committees when the committees look at gender and defense budgeting. So the Minister of Finance is now supposed to look at gender-based analysis in defense budgeting. The Standing Committee on Finance in Canada, for instance, recently added GBA to its pre-budget consultations, and these consultations are held with businesses, with people who procure, people who are part of the procurement sector, with women's organizations, and with civil society. So that we're trying to engender this in very many ways. I think Austria is a good example of how GBA, gender-based analysis, was integrated into the Federal Budget Act. And under each of the 33 chapters of their budget, the minister must define 5 outcomes, and one of them is gender equality and gender-based analysis in that kind of budgeting. So some parliaments are moving forward. But, you know, I think first and foremost, if this is going to happen, really, parliaments themselves must be diverse. We only have 30% of women in most states in the OSCE in parliament, and that's not good enough. Some of the Scandinavian states, of course, have 50%, but most states still have 30% or less. And if we don't have women, the diversity, including women, and the diversity of the population base, and in Canada, that's a huge diverse base of racialized, indigenous, ethnic groups, religious groups, etc., they're all part of that. And so we need to talk about how we deal with that. I must say that I'm quite pleased that for the first time, we see that we have, in this particular cabinet, we have women who are as a defense minister, a woman who is a finance minister, and a woman who actually is a foreign affairs minister. So we now have women in the driver's seats, and we have a good chance, therefore, of moving this issue forward. Canada has a gender-based analysis guide that I told you I brought in when I was minister, and that was a long time ago. And the part of our guide says clearly, it is a common misperception that integrating gender into women's equality and into finances actually has a sole emphasis on women and girls. But gender is not defined as women and girls. Gender is defined as the reality of the lives of women, of men, and now we know of non-binary sectors. And therefore, it is not a women's issue, but it's a human rights issue. And I think we need to remember this as we look at how we do gender spending, I want to add something. I noticed in everything I've read a lot about coming up about women, peace and security. We talk a lot about disarmament, but we talk about arms. We talk about, all kinds of armament, military armament. One of the things that I noticed we don't talk about is nuclear disarmament. And we are closer than ever right now in the world to the doomsday clock getting to midnight. The closest we came prior to that was in the 50s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev stepped in and stopped their armed forces from taking that first strike. We're now asking the President of the United States and the presidents of Russia and other countries that have nuclear capacity to look at stopping a first strike when we look at nuclear disarmament. As a young physician, I remember very clearly that I became very involved in this issue when a woman named Dr. Helen Caldicott talked about the biggest public health pandemic and a public health issue we need to look at is nuclear war. Nuclear war, unlike climate change, will create decades of nuclear winter where climate change would be a joke. So we need to consider nuclear war and nuclear disarmament as part of what we need to talk about when we talk about disarmament, or else we won't be able to talk about anything else if we are in fact devastated by global first strikes. And we need to be careful because now we no longer have to deal with the United States and European nations with nuclear capacity, i.e. the Russian Federation, but we need to recognize we have a lot of rogue nations that have nuclear capacity, Iran, North Korea, who will, at a drop of a hat, move forward to take a first strike. And so I want us to consider that. Thank you very much.
Dr. Fry, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's a very powerful place to pause in your initial comments, because of course this question about military expending is intimately tied for some countries at least with financing their nuclear power. I think you've made so many very rich points. I particularly took from your comments your focus on gender responsive budgeting, which I hope we can come back to in the discussion. And I think your mention of feminist foreign policy and what role that might play is also very interesting. So I hope we get some questions that might explore those themes. Thank you, Dr. Fry. Estefania, if I could now turn to you, please tell us a bit about how women in Mexico and your organization Intersecta is engaging with the issue of military spending. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I'm actually traveling, so I'm blurring because it's my hotel behind me. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm learning so much. And all of your papers, Dr. Ruth, I just obviously already downloaded them, and it's very exciting to be here. I am working in a Mexican NGO called Intersecta, and we work on militarization in Mexico. And hopefully, this is a new issue that we're working on. So compared, I think, to everybody else on the panel who has been working on this, thinking about this for far longer, we are still new in comparison to this work. But I hope that our own story as to why we're delving into these issues can also bring to the table some of the obstacles we're encountering when trying to make military spending, in this case, an issue that is relevant both for feminists and non-feminists, and I think most importantly, to curb military spending. I think both Dr. Ruth and Dr. Hedy already put on the table what for us are key questions, that this isn't just about money. This is about what we believe makes us safe. This is about what we believe makes people's lives thrive better. And I think this is one of the core questions that of how militarization in Mexico is playing out. So I'm going to start with, how did we get involved in this issue? I think I'm sure most of you have read at one point or another how Mexico is one of the countries that is in crisis. On average, 100 people are killed in Mexico every day. It's 90 men are killed every day, 10 women are killed every day. We have currently, the latest numbers are 80,000 people that are disappeared in the country. And one of the big questions, of course, is how we got into this crisis. I said it in average number of people being killed, but the last time I checked, for example, in the US, the murder rate is of about 5 for every 100,000 people. In Mexico, it's 30. So that's the magnitude of our crisis. There are two very common narratives as to how we got into this crisis. The first has to do, of course, with organized crime, which now it's not just drug trafficking, but it invokes the concept of narcos, this idea that narcos are killing each other, and there's sort of like this spillover effect. So organized crime is like this enormous monster that needs to be controlled. That's one narrative. A complementing narrative is that the other big problem in our country is impunity. People don't get punished enough, and because people don't get punished enough, crime is just rampant. Now, what happens with women in this case? As you also know, in Mexico is famous because in the 90s, there was an increase of women being killed. In those cases, there was not only an increase, but a mishandling of the investigations. Women were stereotyped, women were re-victimized. So we come as feminists into this crisis with already a narrative of how state misogyny and state impunity favor women's homicides. What the hell does militarization have to do with it? Well, it turns out that if you actually start looking at the data of when both men's and women's homicides started increasing, they were both decreasing for years, for decades. And they reached the lowest point since 1985 in 2007. And starting 2007, they started increasing to the point where we are now. That's one big change. So this increase has that particular date. A second change that happened, and this is particularly interesting with regards to women, is that traditionally, more women were killed in the home. But starting in 2007, homicides in the streets started increasing to the point in which they surpassed homicides in the home. Now, women are still killed disproportionately in the home when compared to men. But if you see where more women are killed, it's no longer the home. It's not that we improved women's life in the home, but that we added a new problem to the mix. Now, the third big change is that the number of women killed with firearms increased dramatically. For example, in 2007, out of every 10 women killed, 3 were killed with firearms, and today that's 6 out of 10. They doubled. We see even a greater increase in the rate of women killed by firearms than in the case of men. So there's this disproportionate impact of particularly firearm violence when it comes to women. Now, the big question, of course, is why did this increase happen, and why did this change in dynamics happen? Research had started to be done, particularly since 2011, that started questioning whether militarization had something to do with this. So in 2006, we had a new president called Presidente Felipe Calderón. He had a slightly problem of political legitimacy. For many, he won by fraud. For others, he won by a very low margin. But what he did was declare a war on drugs, declare a war on organized crime, and increase military presence throughout the country. So in the case of Mexico, we're dealing with militarization from within. It's not just military spending to do wars abroad against other states. It's using the military against its own population. Now, they started increasing both the number of soldiers being deployed, and of course, they started increasing the budget for military spending, particularly for this. And one of the third things that we have found is that they started increasing the production, exportation, importation of guns. Now, instead, this was all made with the problems of decreasing violence, but as I said, violence was already decreasing. So they basically invented a problem. They gave us this solution, and it not only failed to contain, let alone reduce the violence. But what we have seen, and this is the report where we did with another professor from another public research center, is how militarization, as seen through military confrontations with supposed groups of organized crime, has actually detonated an increase in homicides, not just of men, but of women too. So that is where we come into this issue. And we have stayed here, not just as that, we're part of our work is focused on how militarization impacts men and women's rights in different contexts. This, for example, is an example of how they trigger violence. We're also seeing militarization in the context of detentions, for example. We have evidence showing how when comparing military to the police, soldiers are the ones that are the most arbitrary. They rarely detain people with a warrant, for example. They just yank people from wherever they are. They're the ones that torture the most in every single indicator. As you can imagine, sexual torture in particular is just appalling. The last data we have from this survey from 2016, for example, showed that of the women in prison who were detained by police, 1 in 10 were raped. Of those women in prison detained by the army, it's 2 out of 10. Of the women detained by Marines, it's 4 out of 10 who suffered rape. No? So all of our public security institutions are problematic, but there are levels. No? Now, when you say or when you mention human rights abuses, and this also comes to the question of budgets, no? One of the most common responses we get is if they admit that there is a slight problem of human rights violations, and I think you mentioned this, Dr. Ruth, the great big solution we get is military training. You know? And this is actually a solution that in our case has been promoted by the Inter-American Court in several cases in which Mexico has been condemned for military abuses. We have at least 3 cases before the Inter-American Court involving women, 2 of them indigenous women who were raped and tortured by the military in 2002, and another case of 2 women and a man who were disappeared by the army in Chihuahua in 2009. In all those cases, the Inter-American Court was, among the many things you have to do, is train the military. Now, together with 2 other organizations, last year with the 10th anniversary of the cases of Inés and Valentina, we wanted to know what has happened in this regard. And of course, the most important question is whether it's useful at all or not, because we get sold this as the ultimate way to curb military violence. And it was very interesting because we just sent out requests to access to public information. This has been a very important tool for us. You called it, Megan said, the Freedom of Information Act equivalent. And it was very funny because the questions were very simple. It's like, since 2010, what have you done regarding military trainings? Like, please mention, please give us a syllabus. Please give us the professor list. Please give us how much you have spent on this. Please give us how many soldiers and what level soldiers have taken these courses. What has been the format? What has been the mechanism to evaluate whether this is good or not? What is not surprising is that we weren't able to get 1 syllabus, just 1. We weren't able to get 1 list of professors giving anything. Regarding the budget, we got contradictory responses. And of course, the responses was that they wouldn't tell us exactly what courses they were offering the soldiers. So all the budget information was incomplete as far as we knew. Now, in the best case scenario, what we got was that they were offering 2-hour online conferences massively to thousands of soldiers at the same time on gender equality. Also, the big question, of course, is how the hell is this ever going to be useful, especially when you contrast it with the fact, and I think this goes to the broader point of what safety is, where in the morning, they're learning how to operate tanks and missiles and kill people. And then in the afternoon, it's like, you know what? You shouldn't torture so much, and you should particularly take care of women. Right? So one of the questions we're dealing with is the broader model of security. in the sense that this is a model based on literally killing people. Because we also have, speaking to the point of representation, in Mexico, and I'll conclude with this, they included parity in the Constitution 2 years ago for all public institutions. So now there's the mandate to make sure that every single public institution has parity. This, of course, includes the military. So one of the things that we're seeing and that I find very interesting is what I think is more of a purple washing. I think women have the right to work. Women have the right to work in safe environments. This includes women's careers, but the way gender equality discourse is being, I think, weaponized. We're not such a bad institution. We're trying to be more inclusive, while every single indicator of violence continues to be incredibly high. That is one of the questions. Anyway, so this is the type of work we're doing. This is the type of questions we're dealing with. And in all of this, where we would love to go, I think, and that is why this panel is also inspiring, is behind this, again, we are betting for a model of safety. This is where our dollars, our Mexican pesos, are going to. More guns, more training to kill, but it's not keep making us safer. Quite the contrary. There is evidence that this is unleashing further violence, and we need to have a conversation about changing completely the model of security that we have. Thank you so much.
Estefania, thank you so much. Well, that was fascinating. I found that really powerful, I think, in illustrating that, military spending is not this big out there thing that's around how our armies defend our borders and what nuclear weapons they generate and what fighter jets they buy, but very much this internal process of militarization, whereas you're describing, I think many of us around the world are seeing soldiers on the streets much more than we used to, and this sort of celebration of the role of the military in responding to COVID and in doing all these things that are jobs that should be done by police officers in terms of good governance, or in some cases done by nurses and not by people in military uniforms at all. And challenging that internal dimension, I think, is a really interesting approach. I was particularly interested in your description of using, a freedom of information request as part of your advocacy strategy, but coming up against this pervasive secrecy around what the military do and how they spend our taxpayers' money. So finally, before we go to Q&A, Abby, turning to you. So you obviously have so much experience in this area, like yourself, talk for days on it. But if you could just give us some pointers around some of the entry points and technical mechanisms that activists and others have used to try and reverse military spending and encourage this greater investment in human security. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring panel. As other panelists have highlighted, curbing military spending has been a strategic objective of the feminist and women's peace movements and a core commitment of the UN since its foundation. And mobilization by civil society, including campaigns such as by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, have recently contributed to raising the profile of this issue within women, peace, and security discussions. And as Dr. Bostic noted earlier, reducing spending, of course, is also now one of the Secretary General's 5 women, peace, and security goals for the decade. However, while the need to move the money from war to peace has increasingly been recognized, it has been much harder to identify how to make this shift. And some of the pieces have come out already of the discussion, which is really helpful today. On my side, I think just wanted to highlight that in order to reduce military spending and invest in human security, parliaments need to be able to leverage pressure from civil society and work with national oversight and coordination mechanisms to shift institutional priorities towards human security objectives. And this really requires 3 major things. First, strengthening accountability on military spending. Second, institutionalizing investments in peace. And third, strengthening policy coherence for inclusive peace that advances women's participation, protection, and rights. So first, what kind of entry points and technical mechanisms have been explored to reverse military spending? Of course, political leadership is essential to shift priorities from military solutions towards diplomacy and upstream conflict prevention. However, because as both Dr. Carlitz and Dr. Fry have noted, military spending can be a black box, parliamentarians and national oversight bodies also have key roles to play in strengthening transparency and accountability through civilian oversight. Parliaments can limit military expansion by taking steps to review security sector expenditures in line with priorities, phase out unnecessary ventures, eliminate waste, prevent corruption, and convert military to civilian initiatives. So in Chile, the repeal of the Copper Law in 2019 is a good practice example of reforming military funding systems. In this case, repealing the law ended off the budget transactions to ensure transparency and make funds once automatically allocated to the military open to other ministries. In addition, in Uruguay after the 1980s dictatorship, women parliamentarians were instrumental to developing laws to strengthen democratic inclusion, transparency, and anti-corruption for the military. And they were eventually able to reduce the military mandate and budget and move government positions previously under the military to civilian control. Unfortunately, however, it's often difficult to move funding across budget lines. That said, innovative fiscal schemes have also been explored as ways of shifting funding. For example, in the US, revenues raised from cigarette taxes have been directed toward social priorities, such as education or cancer research. Similar mechanisms could be explored elsewhere, for example, to direct taxes on guns to support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So second, what entry points and technical mechanisms have been explored to encourage greater investment in human security? Bold vision is needed to adequately value and invest in human security in the face of patriarchal systems which chronically undervalue and underinvest in gender equality and peace. To create an enabling environment for national action, international financial institutions have a key role to play in promoting investment in human security by refraining from austerity measures and supporting strong social protections. The international community also needs to come together to act on campaigns for tax justice in order to ensure that corporations contribute fairly to investments in social protections. In addition, national governments can also take steps to create or to strengthen dedicated institutions for gender equality and peace. Bolivia's Ministry of Cultures, Decolonialization, and Depatriarchalization is pioneering in its aim to decolonize and depatriarchalize and reverse inequality between nationalities, as well as between men and women. Ministries of peace have been established in Costa Rica, Nepal, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Ethiopia. And parliamentary budget committees can also use earmarks or utilize gender-responsive budgeting, as highlighted earlier, to mainstream gender priorities in existing institutions. For example, 17% of countries today have gender-targeted funding to promote women's political participation. And in addition, more than 80 countries have undertaken some form of gender-responsive budgeting initiatives, although the quality varies. However, gender-responsive budgeting has often focused on mainstreaming gender in socioeconomic budget lines rather than in security budgets or across budgets as a whole. Consequently, it's not always been well positioned to move money from military to social protection. The main opportunity for funding human security is more comprehensive policy coherence. The 2015 Sustainable Development Goals commit to advancing sustainable development for people and planet. They also commit to ensuring policy coherence across the goals, including on gender equality and peace. Supreme audit institutions are key actors in laying the groundwork for a whole of government approach, which promote policy coherence on SDG commitments. This is because they can audit national budgets across, not just within sectors, and increasingly have mandates to audit performance, including on human rights and sustainable development. This means they at least have the potential to address so-called spillover issues, such as the gendered impacts of arms transfers that we've heard about already. Supreme audit institutions can engage civil society and national human rights institutions to raise concern. They can also engage with legislatures and SDG coordination bodies to leverage these audits as diagnostic tools. In addition, as an outside-the-box option, some civil society have raised the idea of having unified budgets, human rights budgets, or human security budgets. Such integrated budgets would break down, often in flexible silos, to enable more flexible reallocation of funding across sectors. So, how do we shift our funding priorities? Today, we must recognize that it is a myth that we do not have the money to invest in gender equality and peace. For inclusive and sustainable peace, we must amplify the calls of feminist and women's peace movements to shift our priorities from militarized security towards human security and work together to realize the Secretary General's forward-looking goals on women, peace, and security. By strengthening military accountability, prioritizing gender and peace investments, and promoting policy coherence, we can strengthen efforts to prevent conflict and sustain peace through human security that advances women's participation, protection, and rights. Thanks.
Abby, thanks so much. That was really great. And I feel like it was very hopeful. Like you are really giving us ideas of, for me, institutions I hadn't really thought of as players in this sense, in the sense of things like audit institutions. It all sounds very technocratic. I think many of us are not really thinking about how we could engage with them. And things like fiscal schemes and tax justice. Again, these are issues sort of not much talked about generally within WPS policy making and these, this policy world we tend to work in. So I think that's really, really interesting. I hope we can explore it more in the questions and as I say, quite positive. So we now have 15 to 20 minutes for you, the audience's questions to any of our panelists. As was said, you can ask these through the chat. And we have a multilingual team in the background who can relay them to me so I can ask them in English. We have one already that I'm going to start with in a minute, but please do keep them coming in. If you'd like to send them to a particular person, indicate. But otherwise, what I'll do is I'll ask one of the panelists to respond. But if other of you, Dr. Fry, Ruth, Estefania, Abby, if you would also like to respond on the question, please put your hand up so I know who to turn to. I'm sorry, this is a bit less natural on Zoom than it would be if we were in a room together. So the first question I'm going to address to Estefania. Somebody has asked, what's the scope for the implementation of the WPS agenda to address violence that results from governance issues at the domestic and regional level? And they say, for example, addressing the war on organized crime in Mexico. So of course you address some of this in your presentation, but I thought it would be really interesting to reflect on to what extent activism in Mexico around the WPS agenda, or indeed government mechanisms around WPS, are able to play a positive role in relation to this militarized violence you were describing. Over to you.
So this is my perception. I think the women, peace, and security agenda, as I think most of you know, is not as prevalent in Mexico as other framings are. Again, many of women's problems have been articulated as a problem of impunity. So a lot of the focus has been more like prosecutors, judges, without necessarily touching on this framing. And for example, I keep forgetting, but what's the name of the resolution from 2000 of the Women, Peace, and Security? That doesn't figure in my world, really. In comparison to other, in comparison to CEDAW, in comparison to Belém do Pará, in comparison to Campo Algodonero, the cotton field ruling from Corte Interamericana. So I think that's one important thing that I want to mention. We have seen, however, particularly in the last 2 years, the National Women's Institute released their plan for women, peace, and security. It includes the armed forces, and it's the only actually relevant actors, no, the Army, the Marines, and our National Guard, which is supposed to be a civil institution, but it's actually just the army in disguise. And that plan that tries, also invoking this framing, that tries alluding to the 2000 resolution and the subsequent resolutions on women, peace, and security, is focused almost entirely on two things: increasing the number of women in the army and military training. So that's why I'm also worried as to how this framing, and this tradition that, as you guys demonstrated, goes a long time. There is a long feminist tradition on critiquing war and military spending, and that there's this great potential, but how I see it's being translated, it can very easily, I believe, lead to purple washing. So that's one of our concerns. I don't know if that answers the question.
Estefania, I think it very clearly does. I think that's a very interesting, critical perspective that you're putting, that many of us have been reflecting on and will continue to. Dr. Fry, can I ask you to reflect on this question? Because one of the questions in the chat has really said, well, what's your opinion on this in Canada, where the military is doing lots of training on gender? I know the Canadian military has a lot of internal gender equality processes, structures, training now. Do you think this is in any way reaching these bigger questions of militarization and military spending? Do you have a sense of whether that is able to shift military priorities, or rather, perhaps, as Estefania is suggesting in Mexico, leads to legitimization of the military without really destabilizing these more problematic roles it plays in relation to global insecurity? Sorry, that was a very long question.
I'm going to try to get through it, but before I do, I wanted to comment on Estefania, because you made me suddenly think about it. We always think, when we talk about disarmament, etc., about disarming military, about arms control measures with other countries, etc., etc. But civil society in itself, in some countries, are armed to the teeth, and organized crime supplies those arms. And I know that in Canada, we have taken this disarmament of our civil society seriously. And we are banning assault weapons in civil society. We think it has absolutely no place in civil society. Its place is in war and not in a nation state. We're also looking at some of the things you talked about with regard to the military, is that Canada's military, which was once very well thought of, even though they're all doing GBA and all of those processes are being followed, there seems to be a rot at the top, where accusations of sexual predatory behavior within the military on women in the military is coming up very regularly now at the top levels. And so we have just given the work to a judge who is an international judge of the International Criminal Court, Canadian judge named Louise Arbour, to look into this and to do something about it, because the military isn't capable of doing anything about it. It's been going on for far too long, and was a case of the fox, as we say in Canada, watching the hen house. So basically, we needed to get an independent voice. And Louise Arbour, as you well know, is extremely well thought of internationally. So she's going to bring that. And that's another reason that we made the new defense minister a woman, to get down and dig into whatever is going on there. So, as we talk about disarmament and we talk about militarization, we're not talking about some of the things that are really important. In some countries, it didn't occur to me. I kept thinking Canada and arms and buying arms and selling drones and all of that kind of thing. And I didn't stop to think of the fact that organized crime is a huge target that we need to look at, because it is responsible for a lot of the distribution of arms to civilians. We're dealing with that in Canada right now. And the public is very much in favor of this. So I don't know if that answers the question. I have a feeling it didn't, Megan. I don't know. Did it answer the question?
I think it mostly did answer a slightly impossible question. So yes, thank you. Abby, the next question is directed to you. Somebody has asked essentially for more about your example of a Supreme Audit Authority. Could you provide some more depth in terms of that as a potential model? Are there countries where that sort of authority actually exists, or where it has looked at defence spending issues? Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. So I think this is an area that is sort of in development. So what I've seen is that there have been discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals about Supreme Audit institutions' contributions to the goals. And of course, as you know, the SDGs, so they include goals on gender equality and peace. And some of the things that overlap between those, as have come up in this discussion, are around, the gender-based violence impacts of arms. So we see it in Mexico, we see it in around the world when there's transferring of arms. Civil society has brought attention to how arms transfers contribute to sexual and gender-based violence, and we can see that this link is problematic. But people tend to, when they're looking at the goals, still sort of stay in their silos. They still sort of are looking at gender equality separate from peace and not always looking at these interaction effects. So I think there's been preliminary meetings of Supreme Audit institutions on how they can better contribute to the SDGs, and some of the areas that they've looked at in addition to gender equality have been on policy coherence. So they have had those discussions, but the SDGs were only created 6 years ago. Peace was only reviewed a few years ago, and I think the discussions are still preliminary. So I think it would be up to civil society to be really pushing for these institutions to engage with civil society and to prioritize these links between GBV and arms, which of course, as we know from the Arms Trade Treaty, we have the gender-based violence criterion, which says that states cannot transfer arms, if there's a overriding risk of GBV. How are we integrating that as part of policy coherence? So I think it's waiting for civil society to put a spotlight on this issue.
Abby, thank you very much. Ruth, the next question is maybe a difficult one, and I'm going to address it to you if I may. Somebody has asked if the panel could comment on the role of military spending in richer countries, especially the USA, but also, for example, Gulf states, pointing out that there's sometimes a slippage in WPS discussions between a focus on military spending per se and military spending in conflict-affected countries, but pointing out that, or claiming that the role of the USA in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the war in Yemen suggests that rich countries are also a significant part of the problem. So quite a broad issue to raise, but Ruth, are you still there? Can't see you anymore.
I am, yes.
Thank you. Ruth, I wondered if you could comment on that, because I think you have that global overview of military spending in different regions.
Sure, and this is part of the measurement challenge, actually, of what actually gets reported as military spending. So in my analysis, those comparisons that I'm making have been looking at military spending as a proportion of total spending. And so there we do see higher rates in conflict-affected countries, but that language, even, this is the World Bank term of conflict-affected, is this passive voice. But as the questioner points out, I mean, those conflicts didn't start out of nowhere. And so I think taking a global view is absolutely important, and relates to some of the other questions in the chat about, countries that don't sign up to this agenda, how to hold them accountable. I think for countries where international actors are involved in either providing foreign aid or peace building, these sorts of initiatives, how can they sort of think critically and not let these exercises become box ticking exercises? And so I think I found Estefania's example so incredibly powerful, and I think we can find parallels in sort of conversations around Me Too and things like this. Okay, now we have an online training. And so I think this is actually where the call for disaggregated budgets, line item data, it sounds technical but that's what it can get at. It can tell us how is this money being used, whether it's a government, but also I think it's, I think this is a great question because also the donors and the international actors should also be transparent, because a lot of the effects that we're seeing, these are not coming out of nowhere, and the solutions being offered, these are often sort of maybe one size fits all kinds of things, and then aid recipient countries, for instance, or countries that want to join different international federations can say, oh yeah, we're addressing gender. Look, we have these 5 things, but actually sort of, asking both the donors, the international actors to be transparent about what they're supporting, and then asking the sort of recipients, countries being supported by these initiatives to more clearly document what they're doing, I think would help move the needle there a bit.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that, yeah. I'm just going to ask, I'm going to throw together the final 2 questions as one question, if I may, and perhaps just open it up to the panel to see who might like to respond on this, I think, difficult one, and then follow up with a question specifically to Ruth, because I think she may have research on this. So somebody has asked a really good question about how, when we talk about the role of women in security and peace, we can do that from a feminist standpoint without following traditional pathways that see women as nurturing, as caring, as global mothers, and avoid using this stereotypical language. So the question is sort of about how we invoke the role of women in relation to disarmament and military spending, without at the same time reinforcing these problematic stereotypes about what femininity is and what women are like. And then the follow-up question, which perhaps Ruth you can answer, though I'm not sure if there is research on this, is there any research suggesting that women's increased participation in military institutions in particular, maybe we could also think about as defence ministers, for example, contributes to disarmament and reduced military spending? Dr. Fry, I'll go to you first. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I do think that as we speak to gender issues and gender-based analysis and women, peace and security, we do have a tendency, therefore, to suggest that this is a great fix. Once you get women in there, women are so kind and gentle and empathetic and generous that we're going to always do the right things. And I have personally found that that is not so. And so I think that, but at the same time, we find that women are interested in the issues that pertain to human security, mainly because women have sons and daughters who fight in military and die, and women therefore have a vested interest in ensuring that that does not happen. We also know that women are, in fact, the most targeted in conflict. So the issue of bringing about peace is in fact a personal protective issue for women, because again, the fact that, rape is now a tactic of war in many countries of conflict, and therefore women are always targeted. And of course, the people who flee, who are refugees, who tend to be alone with their children and have no say, no voice, and no papers or documentation when they flee their home countries in terms of war, are women. So women have a vested interest. So I think we can take away the stereotyping and look at women's fact that there is a vested interest in women being more involved in that. At the same time, I do take the point that we got to stop stereotyping women to be kinder and gentler. In many ways, this is not so. And in fact, I think this is a problem. I just wanted to make one quick point, though, and that is, we were talking just now about militarization, et cetera, and disarmament, but we now see that Russia is encroaching in the Ukraine. the United States and NATO countries are going to get involved. There is a good chance that there will be an escalation of war there. And I mean, I think, again, every time we try to move away from saying that we want to demilitarize, we have countries saying, oh, no, you can't do that. We got to protect ourselves. We got to protect each other. We got to prevent war. We've got to do all of these kinds of things. So there's a huge conundrum here that it is not a simple equation, you know, and I just want us to try and get around the fact that there is no simple answer, that there are so many interactive factors that make this complex issue so very difficult to deal with.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. Ruth, did you want to respond at all on that question?
Sure. So maybe I'll just quickly react on this sort of essentializing of certain women's characteristics. And I think at least in my research and others that I've cited, we're careful to not sort of try to essentialize women, but rather there's a influential work by Anne Phillips called The Politics of Presence, which really thinks about the impact of women's representation based on women's experiences. So women are socialized in these gendered ways, and by having more caretaking responsibilities, or as Dr. Fry said, you know, being the mother of someone who's sent to be part of the military, you know, those experiences then inform their decision making. And so more inclusive governance brings in more people with more experiences who can bring those to bear. And so leaving women out leaves out those experiences and those sort of socialized gender norms. And so I think that is a really key point, and not just saying there's something about women as women. And there's even studies to show that, you know, women, when they first enter government, are less corrupt, but the longer they stick around, they become just as corrupt as men. And it's because part of it is about just having access to those back rooms. And it's not that women are sort of pure and clean. So I think that's a good narrative to push back on. To this question, specifically, I think, you know, for better or for worse, there are so few women defense ministers that it's hard to sort of draw, like, my research is mostly quantitative, and it's hard to really say what is the effect of this. There is some evidence, and I'll share a link just now to a recent study, that when women take on these more prominent cabinet positions in defense and foreign affairs, ratings of government trust change to some degree. And so sort of confidence and satisfaction with government increase. And I think this is, I actually took a note because I think this is an open area of research that I'm interested to explore and see what others have done and maybe contribute to myself. So thanks for that.
Ruth, thank you. So I'm conscious I want to leave time for Nora and Pablo to add their reflections, but finally, Abby, on the panel, turning to you for your comments.
Thanks, and I'll try to make it brief. Megan, just to say that I think that it undersells women and it undersells peace if we conflate women with peace. And it's really important that we disaggregate these things. I think in peace processes, I think Jana Krause is the one who came up with an article that showed that the reason why peace agreements are more sustainable when women are included is because both women are there in terms of their direct participation, but then they open the doors to engagement with women's civil society. And that partnership is what broadens the peace agreements and enhances the sustainability long term. So I think it's really important that when we're discussing this, we don't essentialize women, but we make sure that we are advancing women's participation because they have the right to be there, not just because they're adding this new value for whatever stereotypical reason, and that we're also supporting a gender perspective, that really addresses women's participation, protection, and rights, and that requires a strong engagement with civil society, who always have, a really bold vision to build on. Thanks.
Great points, Abigail. Thank you. So I think we've had a brilliant discussion already, and I know I could certainly keep talking about this for a long time, but I wanted to, in a sense, give the final words to our colleagues at UN ODA and from UN Women, because really, as our opening remarks highlighted, a lot has happened in the UN system on this question around the links between WPS and military spending in the last few years. And I thought it would be really interesting to learn from them broadly how the UN work on this is working and how we in broader civil society might be able to better make the links with that. So Nora, first turning to you, as we said at the outset, you work with the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. What sort of lessons can we learn from ODA's work on military spending? What should we be asking of our governments to reinforce that work? Thank you.
Many thanks, Megan. First of all, I would like to thank DCAF, UN Women, and the OSCE for organizing the stimulating event and for inviting the Office for Disarmament Affairs to be part of it. It was incredibly interesting for me to listen to the rich interventions by the panelists, really providing us with very different angles on military spending and providing useful examples also from country experiences. From ODA perspective, let me start by saying a few words on how the reduction of military budget has pursued within the UN, and then move to how this issue could be further addressed within the current discussions on disarmament. So as many of you know, the pursuit of the reduction of military spending has actually a very long-standing history within the UN. It all starts with the UN Charter, which envisages the maintenance of international peace and security with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources. So the reduction of military spending is probably the most concrete disarmament objective written into the Charter. After that, the reduction of military spending has been pursued throughout the Cold War period as a distinct objective within broader negotiations on general and complete disarmament. And within that period, there was also an emergence of a parallel effort to develop means for sharing information and promoting transparency related to military spending between states. And the resulting mechanism is the UN report on military expenditure, which you may know. Another aspect I would like to highlight is that over a period of decades, the reduction of military spending was also examined as a means of obtaining resources needed to meet the development objectives of the UN. So while this is not a new consideration, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has presented us with another opportunity for promoting a common understanding of the relationship between disarmament and development. And that is also why rethinking unconstrained military spending is a key objective within the SG's Agenda for Disarmament. I cannot go into further detail on the background, but if you're interested in this, I encourage consulting an occasional paper that ODA has developed on UN efforts to reduce military expenditures from a historical perspective. Now, the review of these multilateral initiatives over the past decades can give us some leads in terms of how the issue could be addressed in the future within the UN. And one important avenue here is to revive the reduction of military budgets as a distinct disarmament concern and as an integral part of the disarmament toolkit. And so to support this, the UN has been advocating for a human-centered approach to security, which pursues disarmament and arms control as a way to achieve national and human security, calling for a new approach to security, as has also been importantly stressed and outlined by Dr. Fry and Estefania. This, of course, requires political will and also a renewed focus on multilateral diplomacy and confidence building over the investment of huge militaries. What also clearly came out in the interventions today is that women's organizations have been advocating against rising military expenditures now and since decades. So we need to create conditions to ensure that these voices are heard and that they are taken seriously in global policymaking on disarmament and arms control issues by creating space for engagement, discussions and exchange in relevant fora. I think the fact that the WPS community has been increasingly engaged on this subject and is drawing increased attention to it within the UN over the past years, including through the SG's forward-looking goals on WPS and his report on WPS to the Security Council, contributes significantly to reviving the issue as a central disarmament and arms control objective, making it a priority for the organization, but also for its member states, and thereby also supporting the development of new approaches for reducing military expenditures. To develop such new approaches, we also need more research to update the international understanding on the economic, social, and political consequences of military expenditures, and to further examine the links between military spending and other relevant issues such as gender equality and climate change, so that evidence-based policy and advocacy can be developed and promoted. So I was very pleased to hear about the research efforts that Ruth laid out, and here I see further collaboration opportunities between disarmament and WPS actors. There's also a need to reach a new common understanding on the relationship between disarmament and development. And as Abigail stressed, this requires examining possible means to ensure that the resources that are released through disarmament and arms control measures are then also allocated to development, climate change, gender equality, and other socially productive purposes. And this could be achieved through refocused work on disarmament and development at the interagency level, through expert groups and intergovernmental bodies, with the involvement of civil society and academia to elaborate concrete principles and guidelines for such mechanisms. From ODA side, we will continue to appeal for reduced military spending. We will support new initiatives and approaches to achieve this goal. And I look forward to further collaboration between the WPS community and the disarmament actors to pursue this. Thank you very much, Megan.
Nora, thank you very much. And finally, over to you, Pablo, from UN Women's perspective. What is next on your agenda in relation to this issue of military spending? What do you think we need to do to move forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Bastic, you started us off by saying that WPS actors and policy spaces have in some ways neglected the issue of military spending. It's perhaps worse than what would be suggested by saying 4 out of 10 resolutions or 39% national action plans, because those are really measuring mentions of weapons and arms control. And so it's been addressing, the participation of women in disarmament forums, or very technical gender mainstreaming, or arms control, or the Arms Trade Treaty, but not really military spending. If we look at actually reducing the level of military spending, it would be close to zero. And that's what we want to change. That's been changing recently. I guess there's a number of reasons for that, but one of them is that this agenda is born, or gets its name and its normative framework and its highest visibility from the Security Council, and the Security Council has the 5 largest military spenders in the world. But obviously, we want to change that. The first thing that we did this past year was to conduct 3 pieces of research to respond to the Secretary General's new goal. One of them is one of the pieces of research that Dr. Carlitz mentioned. Another it's an expansion or an update on one of the ones that she put on the chat, and then there's another one. And as for next steps, we're working with our UN colleagues that focus on disarmament and on security sector reform to put these new research findings onto a policy brief format with compelling visuals, because nobody reads this in Secretary General's reports and in UN reports, and we need to find a way of pushing this onto the hands of parliamentarians that we work with, especially women parliamentarians and women's organizations in both conflict-affected countries, and some of our WPS donors who are also big military spenders and arms exporters. So that's one. If we're also trying to get some more funding to do a little bit more on this, and I will, one of the ideas that has been floated actually would be to do the research that we've done at a global level, to transpose that onto a few country-specific situations in conflict-affected countries. So basically, it would be to learn from Estefania and the work of her organization in Mexico to do things, to fund things like that in other countries affected by conflict. But also, we've talked about that we need more research or guidance or clarity on what would be the actual entry points to influence military budgets. So Dr. Fry spoke about parliamentary legislation and national coordination on oversight committees. Dr. Ruane talked about innovative financing schemes and supreme audit institutions. And Dr. Carlitz talked about strategies to provide greater scrutiny to off-budget expenditures that are kept out of the public eye. So we need to know more about which actors and at which moments of the process and by which mechanisms to influence this. And then we have to push all of this through our existing WPS actors and platforms. We have lots of global platforms, lots of contacts with lots of politicians and ministers and everything, and we need to use this. And I think that one promising avenue is, as more countries adopt feminist foreign policies, which I hope that will be the case, and there's a greater understanding of what feminist foreign policies mean or should mean, I think that's a good opportunity, because very few people know what a national action plan on 1325 is, but feminist foreign policy is a bit more evident. It's a much more public brand, and it provides more opportunities for citizens and civil society organizations to tell their governments, well, if you mean this, this is what a feminist foreign policy would mean. You can't invest on military spending at the cost of human and social spending. Thank you so much to all the panelists. It was extremely interesting to me.
Pablo, thank you so much also. I think that was a really interesting point to end on, feminist foreign policy, and it might be a good topic for another one of this webinar series, which allows me to segue into one of the final points I wanted to make. In a moment, Natasha is going to post the link to our webinar survey. I would really ask all of you to just take 2 minutes. It really doesn't take very long to complete our webinar evaluation survey. It's obviously very hard to demonstrate the impact of a webinar. And at least if we can say, well, everybody said it was great and they learned stuff, that is really very helpful for us in terms of communicating why we would do this. But really, I really wanted to say now, thank you very much to each of our panelists, Dr. Fry, Estefania, Abigail, Ruth, Nora, Pablo. I think we've had a really good discussion, and I really appreciate you making time to be part of it. I really want to thank Natasha from UN Women, who did all the hard work of putting the webinar together from a technical perspective, and our colleagues at OSCE ODIHR, whom you haven't heard from, but also were integral to planning and organising the webinar with us. I'd like to thank the many, many interpreters who have made this webinar more comprehensible to everybody, and to my colleagues, Marta and Tucker, and the other colleagues at UN Women who have helped behind the scenes in interpreting questions and managing the Q&A for us. The webinar has been recorded in every language, and so next week it should go up on the DCAF YouTube channel. You will be able to watch it again, and you'll be able to share it with friends and colleagues, which I would encourage you to do. I know not everybody was in the right time zone to actually participate live. This webinar series will continue next year. We haven't yet planned the topics for next year. So the webinar survey is a mechanism by which you can say to us, please organise something on this. This is what we're really interested in. So please take that opportunity. We really try and, be responsive to the new issues people are feeling need to be discussed, that they want to be part of this sort of global conversation on. So finally, to say again, thank you all of our participants who've taken part, all of our panelists, and from us at DCAF and from myself, wishing you all the best for a very safe and healthy and happy holiday season, and look forward to seeing you, I hope, in the new year. Thank you.